Let him tell you what he's going to talk about. So thank you, David.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited to have ended up here at the University of South Florida and to be in a spot where I can work with oceanographers. I'm an engineer. I'm not an oceanographer, but I like to pretend to be a biologist and an oceanographer. So just keep that in mind as I speak today. So today I did want to talk about some work from my postdoc, which is looking at oil spills, in particular looking at crude oil plumes in a crossflow or a current, and then touch on some work from my PhD as well, which was looking at the underwater flight or swimming by the sea butterfly Limacina helicina. So I imagine many of you are doing work that's related to oil spills. The Deepwater Horizon spill really grew that field and has really impacted the Gulf economy and the Gulf area tremendously. And so the first thing I want to touch on is just to give you an overview of how Deepwater Horizon has actually affected oil spill science over the last few years. And this is some work that's coming out of a literature survey that several of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins and I did. We looked at about 1,300 oil spill papers over the last 40 or 50 years. This is about 10% of the entire oil spill literature, and looked at things like how has the focus changed over time, and then how have things changed since. So this shows the x-axis here we have time, the year, and on the y-axis we have the number of papers published per year about oil spill science. And you can see that the work really got started in the late 1960s with the Santa Barbara oil spill. We had kind of a long lag through the early 1980s as work kind of decreased and really plateaued. And then work got started again with the Exxon Valdez spill around 1990 and grew fairly steadily through the 90s and 2000s. And then we see this huge jump, the spike in work associated with the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010. We can also plot this on a Symbolog scale here, which we have that here. And we see that the growth of oil spill science has really been exponential over the last 40 or 50 years. And we also plotted the growth of science as a whole. So this is all science papers as a whole. And you can see that oil spill science has actually grown about 4 times faster than science as a whole. So oil spill science is a rapidly growing field, and it's really just accelerated in the last few years. But what about the Gulf? How has the Gulf in particular been impacted and studied? So we were also able to look at papers and tie them to specific geographic regions to look at which areas have really gathered the most interest in terms of oil spill science. So here again we have time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis with these color bands we have the percentage of papers related to a specific geographic region. And so we have, for instance, the North Pacific here at the bottom. We have the North Atlantic, which is right here. We have the Indian and Red Sea up here. And then the Gulf of Mexico is this band right here. And so I've also plotted on here 10 of the 10 largest oil spills of all time, and then the 10 best studied oil spills of all time. The dot size here corresponds to the size of the oil spill, so going from 100,000 tons up to 500,000 tons. And then the color of the dot corresponds to how well studied that oil spill is. So white dots are not studied practically at all, and then these red dots are very well studied, and this is actually a logarithmic scale. So what I want you to see is that most attention has really been focused on the North Pacific over time. This is related to the Exxon Valdez in particular, and the North Atlantic, and this is where a lot of oil spills happen in these two areas. Other areas have not really received as much attention. In particular, the Gulf of Mexico seems to have really been kind of neglected, especially considering that the Ixtoc spill back in 1979 was quite a major spill. You can see that it really attracted a little bit of attention at first, but then that it died out over the next 10 years or so. But then we come to Deepwater Horizon. And so if you look here, we see that in the 2004 to 2008 time band, only about 2% of oil spill science was focused on the Gulf of Mexico. If you look post-Deepwater Horizon, within the last 2 years, over 60% of oil spill science has now shifted to look at the Gulf of Mexico. So this makes the Deepwater Horizon spill already the best studied spill in history. So that has really shifted a lot of attention to the Gulf and has brought a lot of attention and resources to the Gulf as well. So this is just a little advertisement for how Deepwater Horizon has really affected the science community and I just wanted to say a few words about that first before I dive into the science. So what I want to talk about in particular today is oil well blowouts and how those are affected by different environmental forces. So oil well blowouts seem to have become more common recently. There's been expanded offshore oil exploration, and so we see this greater risk of oil and gas blowouts at depth. Of course, the poster child for this now is the Macondo well blowout, in which the Deepwater Horizon case released several million barrels of oil at a depth of 5,000 feet. And so when that happens, you have essentially what looks like this. So here we have a broken riser, and we have a very high pressure surrounding this jet of oil and gas that's escaping from this broken riser. And so this is essentially a turbulent immiscible jet. And that's something we know something about as engineers. And we know that these oil well blowouts form these turbulent immiscible jets, which then they rise and they entrain fluid, they lose their momentum, and they become these multi-phase buoyant plumes. And the behavior of the plume, and thus the oil fate, is really tied to a lot of environmental factors, such as things like stratification in the water column and turbulence in the water column. It's also related to the amount of gas that's released with the oil. And it's also affected by the current or the crossflow. So this is really going to affect, or it really did affect, where the oil ended up after the Deepwater Horizon spill. Another factor that affects where the oil goes is the application of these chemical dispersants. So chemical dispersants were injected into the wellhead, and these chemicals reduce that interfacial tension between the oil and the seawater by a couple orders of magnitude. Now the result of this is that in all that turbulence in that jet, this dramatically reduces the droplet sizes that are created. So without dispersant, you have large droplets that have a lot of buoyancy and they just rise straight to the surface. When this dispersant is injected, you have much smaller droplets that rise very slowly up to the surface, or they're really much more susceptible to other flows, and so they rise much more slowly. So our objective in this work was to look at how this dispersant application and the crossflow or the current would interact, how they would kind of synergistically affect the plume. And so we wanted to look at things like the scaling of the jet, the plume dynamics, droplet size distributions resulting from dispersant application, and the spatial distribution of the droplets within the flow. So these immiscible jets, we know something about immiscible jets from the work of Tang and Masutani back in the early 2000s. And they built up this regime map, which we see here, which really divides the behavior of immiscible jets into different categories based on the combination of a Reynolds number, which compares inertial forces to viscous forces, and an Onus-Organ number, which compares inertial and viscous and interfacial tension forces. And so at low values in this region, low values of both Reynolds and Onus-Organ numbers, we see something that looks like this. We see varicose breakup, we see large droplets being created. As we move to higher Reynolds and Onus-Organ numbers, we move into this transition region, and there we start to see some large droplets, we see a lot of small droplets being created as well. But finally, we increase those numbers even higher, we move up into this atomization regime, and we end up with something that looks like this. So here we have a really fully turbulent immiscible jet with lots of different droplet sizes being created, a full spectrum of different droplet sizes. And so this is, of course, where the Deepwater Horizon jet or plume was. If we plot that approximately on this map, we can see it's right here where this triangle is. Now, we do experiments in the lab, and we obviously can't reach those same conditions as Deepwater Horizon, but we can be within the same regime. So the experiments that I'll be talking about today are represented by this diamond and this square. So they're still in the atomization regime, but they're at a lower Reynolds number and higher Onus-Organ number. Okay, so how did we do this? So we experimentally examined how the dispersants and current or crossflow would affect these jets and plumes. And so we used a towing tank. So this is a fully acrylic towing tank, and this provides for really great optical access. So it's about 2.5 meters long and about 1 meter tall by a meter wide. Above this, we have a rail system, and on that rail system, we have a carriage, which is driven by a stepper motor. So this stepper motor can translate back and forth On that carriage, we have an oil reservoir, which is pressurized by a nitrogen tank. And so this oil reservoir can inject crude oil, real crude oil, down into the tank and back upwards as this turbulent, admissible crude oil jet. And so we can move this carriage along as we do that. And so we're able to study this using 3 different techniques, which I'll describe more in a little bit. We used high-speed visualization in this perspective, and this is to look at how the plume is shaped, just to get a general sense of what the plume looks like. Secondly, we also used a miniature holography system that we inserted inside of the tank. So that's represented here. This mini holocam is what we call it, and that's to measure droplet sizes. And then third, we also want to measure flow. So we want to try to relate droplet positions in space to flow, so we needed to measure the flow as well. And so in order to do that, we used a particle image velocimetry technique in a plane, which you can see here, and you can see it here looking down the length of the tank, so that we could measure flow structures within this jet or plume. So we did experiments with 4 different fluids here. So we did experiments with crude oil only as our control case, and then we added dispersant at 1%. So this is a 1:100 dispersant to oil ratio, mixture of oil and dispersant. Then we increased that dispersant mixture to 1:25 dispersant oil ratio, or DOR. And finally, we also used a fluid that has the same properties, the same viscosity and the same density as the oil, but it's miscible. So this is a mixture of ethyl alcohol and glycerin. And so by doing this, we can make the interfacial tension between the crude oil, or the fluid that we inject, and the seawater vary over a couple orders of magnitude. So basically from about 10 down to essentially 0, well 0 for the miscible oil analog. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This is the setup. This is at the oil spill lab at Hopkins. So here we have the tank. Oops, let's see here. Here we have the tank. It's full of dirty water at this time. You can see the frame surrounding it. We have a carriage on top with a pressure pot, which you can see here. And then a injection tube, which goes down into the tank and points back upwards so that we can inject oil as we move that along. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the holography system. So this was a submersible, miniaturized digital holography camera that one of the grad students that I was working with built. It uses the principle of inline holography to measure droplet sizes. And so the resolution that we were able to measure here was 4 microns per pixel. So that means that the smallest droplet sizes that we could actually measure were about 8 or so microns. This camera essentially has 2 parts. We have a part with a laser and the part with an imaging lens and a CCD with a sample volume in between it. So this is adjustable so we can vary our sample volume. And we inserted this inside of our towing tank in 2 different positions. So in the first position, that's illustrated right here. So here's our tank, and here's looking down the length of the tank. Here our sample volume is in the center of the tank so that the jet would pass beneath that sample volume as it goes down the tank. So we're trying to sample in the middle of the plume in order to get a kind of an overall picture of the droplet size distribution. The second position is located here. So here we rotated this device by 90 degrees and then moved it to the side of the tank. And the reason for this was because we wanted to measure droplets within one particular part of the vortex structure of the plume that we wanted to investigate further. So as I mentioned, we did see a particular vortex structure. Anytime you see a jet and a crossflow, which is essentially what we have here, you're going to have this very characteristic dominant flow structure, which is a counter-rotating vortex pair. So we essentially have this crossflow going from left to right, and we have a jet being injected upwards into that crossflow. So that's going to develop into this counter-rotating vortex pair where we have upward flow in the middle and vortices so that the flow comes down along the outside. We wanted to capture the circulation and the sort of rotation of the flow and really measure that. And so we conducted particle image velocimetry in a plane perpendicular to this counter-rotating vortex pair. So you can see that we had a camera here. We were imaging down the length of the tank in order to capture the flow in this slice. Okay, so what does this look like? So this is a high-speed visualization. This was taken at 250 frames per second, and we're playing it back at 25 frames per second. So on the left-hand side, we have our control case. So this is just injecting crude oil into the tank. So we have no dispersant here. And on the right-hand side, we have the 1% case. So this is 100 dispersant oil ratio. And so you can immediately see that there are some pretty significant differences. For the control case, on the left, we see that we have quite a few large droplets here that are sort of escaping out of this plume structure. So they're rising fairly vertically. They're going up, and they're really making this plume spread vertically in the water. You don't really see that when you add dispersants. You have much smaller droplets that are being created. You don't see any droplets this size, so you see much smaller droplets. And you tend to see more droplets that are trapped kind of in this wake area beneath the plume as well. So it seems like we have more droplets and droplets that are smaller when we add dispersant to this case. What happens when we increase the dispersant even further? Well, you can see that this really looks like an inky black cloud. So this is just very opaque, very, very hard to see through. So we have really even smaller droplets. Here we're looking at really micron scale droplets. We really see no separation of larger droplets from the upper edge of this plume. And we have quite a few of these small droplets that are caught in these wake structures, wake vortices, behind the plume. We can also compare that to the miscible oil analog fluid. So this has been dyed so that you can see the fluid and see that the overall shape of the plume is fairly similar to the case with the most dispersant here. So just to compare all of those at the same time and to look at them at a slightly longer time scale, you can see this really makes plain. So this is the no dispersant case, the 1 to 100 DOR, 1 to 25 DOR, and the miscible oil analog. And so we see, we can really see that this plume has spread quite a bit more in the vertical direction at this location downstream as compared to the cases with dispersant. So, yes, question there?
You shouldn't really focus on the color difference of the miscible oil analog. The fact that that's rare is just because you have to dye it. Is what you're saying?
Right, the color. Yeah, that's right. The shape is here. Shape is what is important here. That's right, because the dye, yeah, it's not equivalent to look at a dyed fluid versus this opaque immiscible fluid. That's a good question. So you can see that the dispersant really dramatically affects where the oil goes within this plume. You can also look at kind of zoom in and look at individual droplets at certain regions here, and you see that here we have large droplets that are kind of escaping from the plume. Here we have some somewhat small droplets that are beginning to escape, and if you look closely, you can see that some of these actually have little threads that are hanging off of them. And so what's happening here is that dispersant is collecting on these droplets, and as they rise, it's lowering the surface tension at certain places and leading to these long threads of oil that are coming off of these droplets. So this is a way that even smaller droplets could then be created from these rising droplets. I also wanted to point out what we see here is a counter-rotating vortex pair. So that's located right here. It's not too obvious from this photo, but I'll show it again later. And so this is really where we see this rotation occurring. So it's not obvious from this perspective, but we'll see that shortly. So in each of these cases, that counter-rotating vortex pair is there, and it's really affecting the distribution of the droplets. Okay, so that's the visualization. Now for the holography part. So we wanted to actually measure how large are these droplets for each of these different cases. And so what this video shows is just the same sort of visualization as we had before, but now we've inserted our mini holocam into the tank, which is right here. And you can see that this is the view from the mini holocam. So as that plume rises through our sample volume, you see the droplets appear here, and then as the plume rises, you see them become less common, so there are fewer droplets here. So we're essentially looking at a sort of a time series of droplets rising through this plume, and so that's what we wanted to characterize. So again, we can do this at different time points. Here we have droplet size distributions at 2 time points, an earlier time point on the left, and then a later time point on the right. So these are the droplet size distributions that we have. So droplet diameter is on the x-axis here in microns, and the number of droplets is on the y-axis. The black histogram represents the no dispersant case. The 1 to 100 represents the case, or the 1 to 100 DOR case with 1% dispersant. And then the case with the most dispersant is in blue. And so what we see here is that we have, actually we had to put these on different axes because there's so many fewer droplets when there's in the no dispersant case. So we only had about 15 to 20 droplets in this bin for the no dispersant case, and we see a peak which is at a smaller diameter and a peak of about 300 microns or 300 droplets for the cases with dispersant. So we have vastly different numbers of droplets here and of different sizes, and so we can boil all these sorts of droplet size distributions down into one characteristic diameter, which is a volume median diameter, and then look at how that changes over time. And so again, we have time on the x-axis here, and droplet diameter on the y-axis, and this is our volume median diameter. So this is a characteristic droplet size for that entire droplet size distribution. Again, the black, which we see here, is the no dispersant case. The red is for the 1 to 100 DOR case, and then the blue is for the 1 to 25 DOR case. And so what do we see here? We see that the no dispersant case, that appears first. So we see that these droplets reach the sample volume before the other cases, which we would expect really because these droplets are larger, and so they would rise more quickly. After some time, we then see the 1 to 100 and the 1 to 25 DOR cases droplets appear as well. They're much smaller, of course, and after a time, they all eventually end up at about 200 microns. So now that we have So that's the droplet size information, and now the third part of putting this puzzle together was to look at what the flow looks like. So this is our PIV data. So here we're looking at a part of the tank. So the field of view that you're looking at is right here. So we're looking down the length of the tank, and the jet is being injected from the right side right here upwards, and the jet is moving down the tank away from you. So what you see here, you see these very small dots are PIV particles, which we seeded the flow with so that we could measure the flow. The large, bright white dots are oil droplets. It turns out that oil droplets actually fluoresce in response to our laser, so that made it quite easy to see. And then finally, the black cloud that you see here is oil that's between the laser sheet and the camera, so that's blocking our view. So this is quite a difficult case to do particle image velocimetry in, but the essential flow features that you see are this upward jet, which rolls up into a